I'm glad that we are able to continue to be connected in the best way we can. As you have probably heard one way or another, there are some hopeful signs of change that might be only a couple of weeks away, but it will be slow. And we do not know how that will potentially affect church gatherings of any kind at this point. But I'm monitoring the situation, and I continue to have contact from the bishop and also from our district superintendent. When we know something of a definitive plan for the month of May, I do plan to send out a letter again to the entire mailing list so that everyone gets the same information. But no matter what, it seems quite obvious that whenever we are permitted to be back together again, there will be precautions put in place to do our very best to ensure everyone's health and safety in the very best way we can. As we begin this time of worship together, we are going to sing the hymn, Be Thou My Vision, and following that, Bernie King will share a prelude to the message.
First in my heart.
Thank you, Bernie, and thanks to Dave and Angie and to Dean for singing with me and humoring me a little bit today to put that together. I know I've been missing the organ music, and it was a blessing to have that today. I'm going to begin this message with a question. If a genie appeared before you and you could have one wish, what would you wish for? And it can't be more wishes, it can't be more genies. Think about that for a moment. What would you wish for? You've heard that in fairy tales when the genie appears and you have one wish or three wishes, whatever it might be, and most people don't seem to choose very wisely. Now, I'm guessing, of course, for most of us right now, at this point, we would be wishing that instantly all of this pandemic would be over. But I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want you to think about that question as if it were coming from God. What would you ask for? That's exactly what happened to Solomon, the main character of today's chapter of the story. You know, we started in the beginning back in January, and we've journeyed through creation, the fall of humanity from the perfect relationship with God, God's pursuit to bring us back into relationship, and then the leadership of the patriarchs, the building of this new nation of Israel, a time of the people of God in oppressive slavery, then deliverance, then wandering. They arrive at the promised land and they go through a time of the leadership with the judges, and now we're at a point in time where the people of God are being led by kings. It began with King Saul, then King David, the man after God's own heart that we talked about just a few weeks ago before Holy Week. Now, King David is growing old in this part of the story, and one of his sons, whose name was Adonijah, sees this opportunity to replace his father, and he makes his move. And with support of close friends, he declares himself as the king. Now, Nathan, the prophet, steps in again. He had been there to talk to David before. Well, he steps in again, and he tells Bathsheba, David's wife, who goes to the king then, who is now weak and feeble, to tell him what's going on. And he knows he has to take matters into his own hands. So he calls for a priest to anoint his son Solomon as king, because he knows that that is God's plan. And then he has Solomon sent out with trumpets and a great celebration. And the followers then of Adonijah scatter, and he's afraid for his life, but Solomon could have had him eliminated, but graciously spares his life. So the torch of being king is passed from David to Solomon. And it begins very good. Life in the kingdom is good. They're strong, they're wealthy, they're at peace, there are no wars tearing apart the kingdom. And Solomon soars in popularity. I want you to hear now from 1 Kings chapter 3, beginning in verse 4, this story of what happens with God and speaking to Solomon. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." And Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I'm only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" And the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I'll give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. So God says, "Solomon, you can have whatever you want." And he asks for wisdom and discernment in leading the people. He will go on, he will write the wisdom literature that we find in the book of Proverbs, and the words of the meaning of life in Ecclesiastes, and then the words of passion and love from the Song of Solomon. He builds the temple of God, and it is amazing and beautiful. All is well. But over time, things began to change. Now, having multiple lives was not uncommon in this day. It wasn't sanctioned by God, but it certainly was not uncommon. But Solomon, he ended up with 700 wives. I would imagine some of you men are rolling that over in your head, how that might go. Oh, and also 300 concubines, basically mistresses, not married but living with him. And then we find later in his life that he builds and bows down before altars to other gods and worships. What changed from this time of anointing and the dream of God to a greatly divided heart? I think it might have begun innocently enough. I mean, basically, he seemed to see himself as the exception to the rule. I want you to hear these words from the beginning of 1 Kings 3. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. That one little word, except. It had been made very clear in earlier history of the Israelite people that certain people were set apart as Levites who cared for the tabernacle, and priests then who would carry out this job of sacrifice and this direct liaison between the people and God's forgiveness. There is more than one account in the book of Numbers of those who didn't follow through with this according to the Israelite law, and it didn't go well for them. But Solomon, maybe because he felt particularly chosen, because he was the son of the great King David, he felt he could act as priest as well. Somehow he saw himself as this exception to the rule. And maybe, though, after this event, many positive things happened in his kingly reign, maybe that was something that kind of lingered in the background and would later affect his life in very profound ways. But he did do some very, very great things. He was very wise, and God blessed him. In 1 Kings chapter 4, beginning in verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Haman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. Now, from that point on, we read of the building of the temple. He employed 180,000 workers over 7 years to complete this sacred masterpiece. And this was completed, and the nation continued to prosper, and the word got out. Good stuff was happening in the land of Israel. People would come from far and near to see this temple and this great king and his palace for themselves. Solomon is truly known as the wisest man and the richest man in the world as they knew it. If you read the details of 1 Kings 10, it's really astounding. It says he yearly gained 25 tons of gold. Tons. He had a palace that was beyond magnificent. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. And it says the whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. And everyone who came then brought these lavish gifts to add to his growing wealth and possessions. But then we end up in chapter 11 of 1 Kings. It says, King Solomon, however, loved foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. And we read these words, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. So first we encounter Solomon seeing himself as the exception to the rules. And now, little by little, he begins to compromise. Now, there are situations, of course, where compromise is good. It can be between people, between parties. It can be a very positive thing. But moral compromise of the heart will be quite costly. Often kings would intermarry with other nations, the goal being to make treaties with their families and with the surrounding nations with the motive of making peace. Tradition or not, with a hopeful outcome or not, Solomon, even though that he knew he was not doing what God wanted for him, Scripture says that he held fast to these women, to these wives, to 700 of them, plus 300 concubines. In 1 Kings 11, beginning in verse 4, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David, his father, had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. He compromised. He did not guard his heart. He did not remain devoted to the God, the one true God. And this would bring great consequence. Beginning in verse 10 of that same chapter. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I'll tear it out of the hand of your son. I'll not tear out the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. As we continue next week, we're going to see how tragically this kingdom, this nation of God's people, is going to experience a great turmoil and will be divided against itself. You know, the story of Solomon really got me to thinking. Remember his dream? When God said he could ask for anything? I wonder if he should have asked for something deeper, something more. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, we should all seek wisdom and discernment, and particularly the wisdom of God. but not only in the matter of leadership, but in matters of the heart. Solomon, we said, also wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, and I want you to hear some words. This whole book is like a search for the meaning of life. And in the first chapter, beginning of verse 12, he says this: I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also to madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and the more knowledge, the more grief. And then when you go to the very last words of this book of Ecclesiastes, the last 2 verses, it says this: Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether as good or evil. There's an obscure little story, very short, in the book of Genesis that I want to refer back to for just a moment. It's in chapter 5, and it begins in verse 21. It's just a few verses long. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him away. The writer of the New Testament book of Hebrews looks back at Enoch and he says this: By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. What if Solomon would have said, God, I just want to walk with you. I want to please you. Give me the wisdom to do that. I want to devote my heart to you completely.